and how do they leverage negotiation skills to be more masterful in their self-leadership, and how to overcome the inner negotiation that we often have with ourselves. So yeah,
Love it.
it's all accidental, and I have a great belief that often, doors will open where others will close, and we have to trust the path that we're being led. And I love the name of the podcast, Magical Learning, as well. So it feels like it was a magical learning opportunity, and an
I love
opportunity
it.
for me to take when the situation arose.
I love that. And one of the things when I was reading your book, and I was like, "Whoa, that is so true," and why everyone should read your book, is that how often we leave money behind on the table. And so if we're negotiating, say, for a salary increase, it's not just the salary increase that we are negotiating, it's things like your super and stuff like that. And so
Oh, so
for
much more.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So for listeners and viewers to realize that this is actually a critical skill,
Yeah.
and the way you explain it and teach it is just a really beautiful way. And I love that. Yeah, it's good at work, but that whole side of your self-leadership, understanding yourself better, and being able to put that on the table. I just loved that idea. So
Yeah.
fabulous, fabulous book. So
Oh,
let me ask
thank
some more
you.
questions now because I'm
Yeah, for
super
sure.
excited. So clearly, you had all this background and it happened as it happened. What then said to you, it's time for me to write this book?
Yeah, good question. I think one of the things that I realized through my career and personally is often we experience situations where we're trying to change outcomes, whether that's personally or professionally. We're trying to influence others and we're trying to make a meaningful contribution. One of the things that I found, even with the company that I previously worked for, was even though we taught negotiation skills, when it came to actually negotiating internally, there was still friction.
Yes.
So it made
Irony,
me,
hey.
yeah, the irony. And I think that was what propelled me to realize that we've got to practice what we preach.
Yes.
So if we are standing and advocating for negotiation, and this is why the connection to identity is so important. So for me, I'm like, well, if I'm teaching others to negotiate, then I have to be willing to negotiate and be persuaded to do things that might not be something that I had initially wanted to do. And seeing how much friction people experience, and I think, as I said, with the executive coaching, seeing women being held back from opportunities or not seeing where the value was in their own identity and the ability they had to add value to their organizations, seeing friends not negotiate value, and then seeing how much I also negotiated with myself. I just thought actually there's a real opportunity here to combine how we as humans make agreements, and how can we lift the level of consciousness around ourselves, and then our consciousness around how others behave. And if we lift that level of consciousness, then we can more effectively make more valuable agreements together with less friction.
Love it. Love it. And such a good book. So just can't say
Oh,
that enough,
thank you
basically.
so much.
So my next question is, why do people either avoid or do quite poorly in negotiation?
Well, one of the things that I've learned through my own journey, through observing clients, through observing delegates, and even learned through a shared quote that Oprah had even shared around her realization through many thousands of interviews that she's done with humans over the time, is that we all have a very deep need to feel valued and to know that we are of value in return to others. And that deep need to feel valued is so strong that we will often do anything to avoid diminishing our own value,
Mm.
because it's a sense of significance that we get to say that we matter ultimately. And when we're negotiating with another party, whilst consciously we may not be aware of it, unconsciously what we're doing is seeking someone to validate that we matter, that what we're asking for is significant and important to us, and that's acknowledged and recognized. And I think we avoid making the ask because if we're rejected, we can make it mean that we were either inappropriate, we didn't know what to say or how to say it, that perhaps someone might judge us or perceive us to be greedy, to perceive us to be inappropriate, to not be knowledgeable enough. And all of those thoughts about how we might be perceived, we take on board as meaning, oh, I'm potentially diminishing my value, and that's really risky. So I want to avoid the loss of diminishing my value, and therefore it's safer for me to not actually negotiate than it is for me to negotiate and get it wrong.
Yep. Oh, that totally makes sense. Yeah. Oh, even that thing about the value. Anyway, we'll come back to that, I'm sure.
Yeah, sure.
So, and in fact, we're coming straight back to it after the next question. So, next question was, what are the foundations that people need to build to be good negotiators?
Yeah, what I've created is a value framework.
Yes.
And in that value framework, it's using the word value as an acronym to talk you through a model that you can walk yourself through. So the V stands for value, and it all begins with identifying your value. Because if you don't know what your value is, then you don't know what you've got to exchange with the other party that you're negotiating with. And when you understand your value clearly, you can then better take time to understand what is it that the other party values in return. And when you understand what both parties value, then what you want to exchange is something that's, say, highly valuable to you, Danette, in exchange for what's highly valuable to me. So if it was a salary negotiation, you might want me to work full time when I want to work 4 days a week. But what might be of greater priority to me is to have 3 of those days working from home, and you're more relaxed about it being a hybrid environment than me being in the office. So we might make a trade-off that says, hey, I'll work 5 days if 3 of those days can be home, and me give up on something that's less valuable to me in exchange for something that's more valuable. So if we look at the value, we can start to discern how we exchange it. Also, when we look at value, what we can do is better identify, well, what's my intrinsic worth? And that doesn't change. So your worth as a human being and my worth as a human being is identical. It's exactly the same. And neither one of us can trade that up or down because it's intrinsic in us being human. But our extrinsic value, the market value, can be very different, and that can be contextual. So if I'm in a situation where there's a high supply of people, then my salary requirements, I'll use that as an easy example, might be lowered because there's an abundance of other people who've got the same skill set. Whereas if my skill set was scarce, then my value might go up with that skill set. So it's more determined by market supply and demand, but also the benefit and the usefulness of your value to the person or business that needs it. So that's
Makes
value,
sense.
step one. As we go through the steps, is that we go through the next one to analyze the data. So it's the A in the value model. And data conjures so many different images, and especially being an ex-accountant, it often used to conjure images of just numbers and spreadsheets and nerds, and now I see it differently. Now I look at data and I think, oh, it's information that gives me confidence, and if I've got confidence, then I'm more likely to do something with that confidence. And information, as we also know, can give you power because it gives you knowledge as well. So knowledge leads to power, and having knowledge can give you confidence. So that data can be analyzed through you and I having a conversation, people gathering information about each other through dialogue, or it might be information I gather through published sources. So there's two sources for data, people or published, and pretty much you've got all your bases covered with those two areas. So I always say, look at the data, because that in itself will reinforce the value that you identified earlier, or tell you if you're smoking something and you need to consider a different solution.
Yep. I love that, Glin.
And then when we get to the third step, which is the L in the value model, it's all about understanding your leverage, because leverage is ultimately identifying, what do I have as a lever that is something someone wants, and what is a lever that they have that I want, and how can we exchange that more effectively? And leverage could be also things that give us more power. So if I've got more time because I don't need to make a decision on an agreement immediately, and I've got time to explore my options, look at other alternatives, then I potentially might have more leverage than you if you needed someone to work with you or to make an agreement or a deal a lot sooner. So when we start to understand the variables in any conversation and any deal that we might be agreeing to, we want to understand where the leverage is most strong, who's got more variables that we want an exchange, and therefore where does the power lie with that. So that's leverage. Then the really tricky one is the step 4, and that's the U, which is embrace feeling uncomfortable. And this is the hardest.
Yes.
Nobody wants to feel uncomfortable, right? When we're in a negotiation, we want to feel comfortable. But from all the negotiations I've had in my own personal experience and all the negotiations that I've seen my delegates participate in, there is not a single person that has not felt uncomfortable. And what I've said to the people that I work with, my clients, is please don't expect to feel comfortable either, because if you do, you're leaving value on the table.
Yes, totally.
Yeah, you're negotiating yourself out of opportunities before you've even engaged. So embrace feeling uncomfortable and recognize that if you are feeling uncomfortable, you're actually allowing for yourself to gain more than you may otherwise if you sit within your comfort zone. And then
That
the
totally
final
makes sense.
step is the execution of the plan. And so the E stands for execute. And it presupposes you have a plan. So the idea being you don't go just straight into a dialogue, that actually any conversation in which you want to reach an agreement, you want to approach with intention. And that intention requires you to think about, what is the plan? What do I need to do before I have the conversation? How will I conduct myself during the conversation? So when I do get uncomfortable, how might I manage that? And if they challenge what I'm proposing, how might I, approach that? And then when I've got myself comfortable with my readiness, I also think about, what will I do once the negotiation is complete? And how do I actually ensure that what's agreed is followed through on? And most people forget that negotiation happens in 3 stages, where you set the stage, design the deal, and then during, how to do the actual negotiating. And then stage 3 is the review what you've agreed, and agree and implement what the agreement was. And so the execution of the plan becomes critical. But if you followed all of the early steps around understanding where value is, what data you've got, and you've analyzed it, you've understood where the leverage is, you've embraced the readiness to feel uncomfortable, then the execution of the planning aspect becomes a lot easier because you've already done the homework in gathering the information you've needed. So, and it's all about value. So if we can remember that's the ultimate objective, is
Yes.
it's an exchange of value with one party to another, then it really keeps us focused on working together more collaboratively as comrades than we might do seeing the other party as a competitive, combative other party, which makes us a lot more uncomfortable.
Yeah, and sometimes some people get a bit aggressive.
Yeah, and they do. And what the skills teach you is how to protect yourself
Yes.
in those environments. Because if you can learn to manage your discomfort, it really helps you learn how to manage the discomfort when someone else is acting out of their ego and their emotional state rather than a more logical, rational, calm state.
I love that. All right. Next bit I wanted to ask was, what's the best piece of advice either you've given or you've received around negotiation?
Yeah, that's a good one. I had to think about that. And I think it was something, what came to me was, it wasn't anything that anyone's told me,
Mhm.
but if I was to give advice, I would say people always negotiate with themselves and often leave money on the table, not through any interaction with anyone else other than the pesky voice in their head. So if you're going to be the one that negotiates, please don't be the one that negotiates with themselves.
I love that advice. That's gorgeous. Um, and before I can sort of get to the next one, I love the story of how your mum made you negotiate when you were younger. So I'd love for you to share that with our listeners and our viewers, Glyn,
Yeah,
if you wouldn't mind, because you loved
absolutely.
it, didn't you?
Oh, it was, oh yeah. So you can still see like the feeling that I had. So my backstory is that my mum was born and raised in India, and she had an arranged marriage with my dad and had moved to England in her early 20s. And shortly after had myself and my younger sister. At the age of 3, my dad and my mum separated, and she was left to raise two young children, myself as a 3-year-old and my sister as a 1-year-old, by herself. But her background in India meant her education stopped when she was age 12 because it was expected that she would be at home and look after the family as the traditional roles were in place for that generation and certainly in India at that time. And therefore, when she moved to England, she had me relatively soon after getting married. And then my sister, there was no opportunity for her to learn English. So, given her context and her circumstance, she was very much focused on, well, what can I do? And that often was manual labor, where language wasn't required. So she was sewing, that was her main occupation. And therefore, what little money we had, my mum wanted to extend a lot further. And she was very brave, very courageous. But her lack of English skills, she's had pidgin English, meant she would often lean on me as a young child, I'd say in my early sort of teenage years, to ask the questions, whether it be, if we were buying a new TV or a household product like a fridge, it'd be, ask them for a discount, like a nudge and a little elbow. And she'd say it in Punjabi and it roughly translated to, well, what's the harm in asking? And I'm thinking, what do you mean the harm in asking? My street cred, they might say no. This makes me feel really uncomfortable. There is a lot of harm being caused right now. So I did initially start asking, but I would feel so embarrassed that eventually, as I got into my teenage, more rebellious years, I stopped. And I stopped, I would push back. It was easier to push back on mum. So that was my
Yep.
comfort zone. It was easier to push back and rebel and say no than it was to lean into my discomfort. And then I watched her continue to negotiate in the absence of English. with her pidgin English to get the outcomes. And 9 out of 10 times she would get a discount and a result. And I
Go,
saw
mum.
that. She was great, and she still is. But it made me realize that I felt there was some level of shame, both the
Yes.
I've challenged my mum and I've rejected her to save myself embarrassment. But when she got a successful result, it was even more obvious that I'd lost out.
Yes.
But for a long time, it still took me, I would say, until I had gone on the professional formal training for me to realize how much my avoidance of negotiation was still playing out from my teenage
Yep.
years. And I only wish now that I knew then how much of well, I wish then that I knew what I know now, sorry,
Yes.
that it was so much of a superpower, and how I could have got so much more value, whether that be monetary or intangible value, in exchange had I not held back.
Mm.
And
Love it. Do
actually
you
followed my mum's
advice? Do you
way of
want to give
operating.
your mum a big shout out now?
Yeah, Kashmir, you're amazing.
Go
And I should
Kashmir.
have and I should have listened to you.
She'll love this because it's recorded.
Absolutely.
What a
Yeah.
fun conversation we've had, Glyn. We're going to have to get you back with the full team and have a good conversation.
Oh,
But
thank you.
I bet we've got some viewers and some listeners who would love to reach out and connect with you. So where's the best place that they can reach out and connect with you?
I feel like LinkedIn for me
Nice.
is my home, mainly because I value such rich connection. And what I found with that platform is being able to see who people actually are, what their
Mm,
roles are, and what their career journeys have been, makes me feel like even if I don't know you, I have got a sense of who you are and what your journey's been. So please connect with me on LinkedIn. And if you do happen to connect with me on LinkedIn, don't be surprised if I mention my book.
yes. And that was my next bit that I was about to add. So I'm betting that there is some listeners and viewers who would like to purchase the negotiation
Yeah,
playbook.
I would
So,
love that.
Glyn, where's the best place for them to find your book?
Yeah, so if you find me on LinkedIn, you'll see I'm there, and you can get a link to my website, which
Yes.
is www.thevaluenegotiator.com, and you
Nice.
can get the book ordered through there. But you could also go direct to Amazon, hopefully the bookstores. You mentioned it was in Canberra Airport. It's been in Paris
And Dimmicks at
and
Melbourne
Dimmicks as
in the
well.
centre.
So any bookstore in Australia at the moment, it's going, I think, overseas next
Nice.
month. So if you're in Australia, definitely pop into a bookstore. Please ask for it. I promise you, there is value for you, even if you think you don't negotiate in a more typical sense, like in sales or in procurement, because it's actually an everyday skill. So I promise you
Yes.
there'll be value in it for you.
And Glyn, is there anything else you'd like to share with our listeners and viewers before we finish up?
I think the one thing I would share is please acknowledge the journey to mastering
Mm.
yourself takes time. Um, but if you can focus on the one skill that can help you master yourself, I do genuinely believe that negotiation will play a part in that, because it's not just what you can get externally, it also develops your emotional intelligence, the way you are aware of yourself and how you interact with others. So give yourself more the gift of you and who you can become is what my parting words would be.
I love that. Thank you so much, Glin Bayley. And to all of our listeners and viewers, and for all of those that have shared our podcast, thank you so much and have a magical week.